good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. And thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Marciniak, and I am the managing partner of the Central Region at CCS Fundraising. It is a pleasure to be with you today and to gather so many leaders and practitioners who are working tirelessly every day to strengthen your organizations, your missions, and ultimately our communities. We're really grateful for all that you do, and we're grateful that you've taken time out of your very busy and full days to join the conversation. Today, we'll be sharing insights from our fifth annual Philanthropy Pulse report. And at CCS Fundraising, this research plays a really important role to understand how we can support our client partners, but also how each of us in the nonprofit sector can contribute to the broader conversation about philanthropy and inform how you might adjust or adapt some of your own practices. This is survey results from you, and it complements other research and surveys that are happening across the industry. We know that now more than ever, nonprofit leaders today are operating in a truly dynamic and sometimes very complex environment. Your expectations for continued impact continues to rise and amplify. Donor engagement is ever evolving, and your own teams are balancing ambition with their own capacity. And so at times like this, having clarity and shared perspective can really help to inform our individual and collective approach and insights. So each year, CCS conducts the Philanthropy Pulse to offer a data-informed, insightful look at how fundraising continues to evolve. And the 2026 report draws on data from more than 600 nonprofit organizations across all geographies, sectors, and missions. And it really reflects what you all are prioritizing in your fundraising performance, in your staffing and team dynamics, in your board engagement, and in your donor strategy. Today's session is really designed to preview to you those key findings and, importantly, show how we're bringing those findings to life. So we'll begin our discussion today with an overview of some of the key themes and findings from the report, and then we'll move into a panel discussion, which will be focused on how we're translating these findings and living them into action. And so throughout the session, we encourage you to add your questions into the chat, and we can address these thematically after the webinar so that everyone will have the benefit to understand the most commonly cited questions and curiosities that you all have. We hope that today you will leave not only informed, but also empowered and a little inspired with ideas that you can take and apply within your own work. And I'm really delighted to be joined by leaders who bring distinct and diverse perspectives to this discussion. And please welcome Melissa Arias from the Make-A-Wish America, Kira Elbert from the Elkins Foundation, and Jeff Shaw from Prairie View A&M University. Each of our three panelists brings firsthand experience navigating fundraising and philanthropy within their own organizations. And so we'll be hearing from each of our three panelists in just a few moments. But first, we'll set the stage with walking through the data. And as we walk through the data and the findings of the report, we'll really look at this through the lens of three frames. First, we want to show you the trends, the major high points that have come through based on the data. Secondly, we'll share a little about why this is important or why these trends are ones to watch. And third, throughout the session and in the report itself, will offer suggested insights and actions to consider and adapt into your own organization. Really, we want to make sure that you can take ideas of translating this data into action. So as we get started, let's ground this data in the survey respondents. In total, we secured survey responses from 618 distinct nonprofit organizations, which represent 47 US states and 18 different countries. An incredible and diverse response. Thank you to everyone who responded to the survey. And if you didn't this year, we hope you will next year. Nearly 2/3 of respondents, 64%, are organizational leaders, and 25% represent frontline or operational fundraising staff. And within these responses, each response reflects organizational input, whether that's from internal contributors or others, but really we aggregated this to be one response per organization. The distribution of respondents includes all different organizational sizes, with 43% of our respondents working in organizations with operating budgets somewhere between $1 and $10 million. And in fact, this distribution of organizational budget size is quite similar to what we've seen in previous years, which allows for us to really understand a steady year-to-year comparison in terms of the budget size and realities. When we look at the respondents by sector, sector representation really spans the nonprofit landscape. 23% come from either primary, secondary, or higher education, 21% from human service organizations, 14% arts, and 7 or 8% from health, religion, and environment, with the rest being a smattering of different sectors. The data also reflects results from each organization's completed fiscal year or end of the calendar year, depending on how your fiscal and calendar years align. And when we ask questions about future or expected changes, that reflects anticipated performance into the next fiscal year. So with all of that said, let's dig into the key findings. Overall, 62% of organizations reported increased revenue in this most recently completed fiscal year, which is reflective of the trend in the previous Pulse report as well. Said through a different lens, about half of organizations reported no increase or a modest increase in their revenue. And about a quarter of organizations reported revenue declines, which really shows us that each nonprofit organization is experiencing a really varied landscape. And whenever we look at data like this, we know that you may be experiencing a lot of different factors, some of which may mirror these results, some of which may go against these trends. And so as you look through the report and listen today, we really encourage you to first focus on long-term sustainable growth, but also understanding where you can make priority changes that may go a long way. When we look at then these revenue gains, we wanted to look at it based on sector trends. And we see that, yes, once again, a varied landscape. Public society benefit, primary and secondary education, and higher education organizations most frequently reported revenue gains in their last fiscal year. And of that, about 3/4 reported increased revenue. Associations reported the greatest share of decreased revenue. And notably, advocacy organizations showed the widest spread in outcomes, from those experiencing declines, no change, or increases. We also see that beyond sector differences, revenue growth did also vary by organizational budget size. Among organizations with operating budgets greater than $500,000 annually. The majority of all sectors in that budget size reported increased revenue. Those with annual operating budgets of 500,000 or less reported no revenue changes in this last fiscal year or modest decreases of 10% or less. So again, thinking about your own sector or your own budget size and your own size organization, consider how this relates to your own experience. Now, one of the key topics in all of philanthropy is donor retention. And as we think about donor retention and even new donor acquisition, we want to understand how not only to acquire donors, but how to retain those new donors and retain loyal donors. When we asked in the survey about 3-year retention averages, organizations reported largely similar results in last year's Pulse report as this year's Pulse report, meaning no major swings in overall 3-year average donor retention. About half of respondents, 44%, cited an average retention rate somewhere between 30 and 60%. Now, our national average is hovering around 47%. So this range really encapsulates that national average. We know that retaining donors between their first and their second gift is often the most important and the most challenging. Though we see that when organizations have the ability to retain donors between their first and second gifts, there's increased retention rates once a donor gives for 2 or more years. When you consider your own organization's retention rates, we also encourage you to look at the differences of retention rates across different giving levels. That will help you to best dedicate your retention efforts based on different donor experiences. We asked organizations how they were planning to utilize different tools for donor retention in the upcoming year. 69% of respondents plan to retain donors with digital communications. 59% of respondents plan to invite donors to regular in-person events. And about 39% of respondents want to or are planning to arrange small group or individual meetings with donors. So these are some key activities to consider, not only for retaining those first-year donors, but also loyal donors as well. Now, of course, a really important complement to donor retention is donor acquisition. And we've seen in this survey that it remains a focus for many organizations, particularly as other revenue streams shift or retract. 60% of organizations in the survey reported an increase in donor acquisition, which is better than the 2 previous reports. 69% of all organizations who reported increased donor acquisition also reported increased donor revenue. Now, we know that donor acquisition is incredibly important and must be combined with donor retention in order to see those types of revenue increases. At the same time, donor acquisition remains one of the most commonly cited challenges across all organizations. In fact, in this survey, 68% of all respondents specifically cited donor acquisition as a continued challenge. So we want to ensure that a balanced fundraising program ensures that you build on a strong base of your existing and loyal donors, and those really strong donor acquisition programs are built with long-term stewardship and long-term retention in mind. Now, perhaps one of the biggest changes from last year's report to this year's report was surrounding government policies. So in this year's report, we saw that government policies and changing regulations really exerted growing pressure on many nonprofit organizations. Nearly half, 47%, reported some kind of negative impact on their organization in the past year due to changes in government policy. Now, that can be any kind of impact, not specifically funding impact. However, we did look at specifically the effects within the sectors and effects within funding. So, among those organizations who responded and said that there were negative impacts, we see that those impacts are most pronounced among associations, environment and animals organizations. Each of those two were the top two sharing the biggest swings. Advocacy organizations, arts and culture, human services, and higher ed also reported the most pronounced negative impacts. In contrast, public society benefit organizations stood out as those who shared and were the most commonly organizations to report positive impacts to changing government policies. And religion is the sector that's largely unaffected or reported no change to government policy. Now, when we looked then at the types of changes and impacts, the most commonly cited impact, perhaps unsurprisingly, was reduced funding, with 61% of nonprofits in the survey reporting some kind of reduced government funding. That could be local, state, or federal funding. So, looking ahead, we also asked about organizations' abilities or plans for seeking and securing government grants in this next fiscal year. And in fact, 45% of organizations anticipate continued decreases in government funding this next year. By comparison, 1 year ago, when we asked this question, just 17% of organizations anticipated decreased government funding. So we saw a real change in this particular component. Now, when we look to opportunities to fill funding gaps, whether that's those left by government grants, or if you're simply looking to grow your philanthropic revenue, individual giving remains a key area of opportunity. We know from Giving USA that individuals represent the largest source of philanthropy in the US each year. Among the varied sources of revenue, responding organizations anticipate the greatest growth in forms of individual giving. Specifically, with 57% of organizations expecting growth in major gifts and 52% of organizations anticipating growth in mid-level gifts. Just behind that, at 49%, annual appeals are expected to remain steady. When we look at this across institutional giving challenges, outlook in this area has softened a bit. The share of organizations who are expecting declines in corporate giving increased. And similarly, the share of organizations anticipating declines in foundation funding was also greater. And as we've noted, public funding continues to remain the most vulnerable and dynamic unknown revenue source. Additionally, I'd like to call out how individuals give as a notable opportunity because 42% of nonprofits responding reported receiving gifts on a one-time basis, and monthly donors represented just 11%. So there's real opportunity here to not only ask for gifts from individuals, but look at those structured in a monthly, recurring giving, or even a multi-year pledge. Now, year over year, we're seeing a steady increase in the share of organizations that are accepting non-cash assets. Half of respondents revealed that either they had no or modest revenue that came from non-cash assets, which tells us that building staff and donor awareness around the opportunity to give through a blend of cash and non-cash assets remains a really critical opportunity for all of us. We also know that as donors become savvier in the ways they structure their giving, organizations need to remain open and nimble to how donors can package and blend gift opportunities. Now, perhaps one of those opportunities that donors will often give with and through is donor advised funds, or DAFs for short. And we have seen through this year's survey that DAFs continue to be a growing source of philanthropic revenue. 95% of all respondents report some kind of familiarity with DAFs, of which 85% actively solicit and receive DAF gifts. Now, with that said, they're not always specifically targeting DAF donors. In other words, DAFs are just no longer a niche vehicle. They're really a part of mainstream giving. And at the same time, DAFs still are a smaller share of the revenue pie for most organizations. Most organizations, 71% of those responding, said that DAFs account for less than 20% of their overall giving. But there is strong correlation here, not causation, but correlation between staff fluency in donor advised funds and donor advised funds revenue. Organizations that have greater familiarity and fluency with DAFs, or have that woven into your practice of asking and talking about DAFs, cite a greater share of their revenue from DAFs. Perhaps that's unsurprising, but that correlation really underscores the importance of continued focus on DAFs. Beyond giving vehicles, boards and our board members remain a continued area of opportunity to build and grow our philanthropy. And what we found in summation from this summary of data is that organizations with clear, consistent expectations for board members often benefit from deeper engagement in all areas of fundraising. Across organizations, expectations of board members most often emphasizes board members' personal financial contributions, with fewer boards requiring active fundraising participation. And we see this as another continued evergreen opportunity to keep board members involved in a variety of ways of the philanthropic and relationship building process. We can never assume that giving requirements or involvement in fundraising is known among board members. It's really important to incorporate this regularly into your onboarding, your orientation sessions, board retreats, and other gatherings, and providing board members with resources to be successful. Because we know, and the data shows us, that organizations that have clearly and consistent defined expectations for board giving do see a larger share of their funding increase. Now, with all of you on the line, working tirelessly every day, we know none of this fundraising can occur without the dedication of staff teams. And among organizations that do have some type of dedicated fundraising staff, 83% in this last year maintained or grew their teams. At the same time, we know that internal capacity is a really important factor. Issues related to organizational readiness, growth pathways, structures, and roles really shaped whether organizations are best positioned to add or retain fundraising staff. In fact, 44% of our survey respondents mentioned upcoming or planned structural changes to their staff functions or reporting lines as a way to be most aligned and nimble and growing. Hiring for key and talented roles continues to really reflect the same kind of core pressures that we've seen in previous Pulse reports. The top two challenges, perhaps unsurprisingly, are limited salary budgets and difficulty finding qualified candidates. And so we know staff retention remains a central topic and an area of focus. And encouragingly so, 1/4 of organizations report no fundraising staff retention challenges. Amazing. But those who are impacted cite most commonly a heavy workload and burnout as the number one reason, with limited career growth opportunities as the second most common reason. Now, the third most common, tied to what we saw in the challenges of hiring, are pay and benefits. So, to combat these retention challenges, about two-thirds of organizations are reporting moderate investment in professional development, and about the same, two-thirds of organizations are reporting investing in competitive compensation methods. One non-comp benefit that a lot of nonprofits lean into is the flexibility, reporting remote or hybrid work schedules as a way and a benefit to retain staff. But digging into this just one tick further, we know that staff pay is a key issue for hiring and retaining talented team members. And we did see correlation between those who reported any type of even modest increases in staff pay to overall revenue growth. Now we know that among all of this, one of the hot topics that we're hearing about a lot is AI. And we are navigating an ever dynamic and changing world of AI and all of its applications to our daily work. In our survey, just over half of nonprofits, 52%, report having an overall positive stance on AI and fundraising. And within that, we saw that 65% do not have any formal staff training, and 71% have no kind of AI strategy. 57% have no formal AI guidelines. So there's opportunity here to go from interest and curiosity to action. And that has to happen, of course, in a thoughtful and measured way. And so when we understand what we can do with AI, we often encourage organizations to consider one, two, or three test use cases to be able to really zoom in on a few areas and scale. Now, we did see that organizations who are utilizing AI are seeing positive revenue trends. So, among those organizations who reported having what they've qualified as a very positive AI stance, among that group, 70% saw revenue increases. Now, again, this is a correlation, not a causation. But what we know again is that organizations that invest in training, governance, and other kind of coordinated leadership around AI can move beyond experimentation and those test use cases into what can become a practical tool for efficiencies that can help reduce staff burnout, different insights that can help us focus on different segments for donor retention and acquisition, and overall sustainable long-term fundraising performance. Now, lastly, we wanted to highlight a look at any trends or changes to DEI in the last year. Over the past year, two-thirds of organizations reported making no major DEI-related changes to their fundraising approaches. Though among the group that have made some type of DEI-related change, 44% of those nonprofits reported updating some kind of internal policies or guidelines, which could be sparked either by a combination of internal decisions or external factors or pressures. Among those that are integrating DEI into their fundraising, the most cited challenge is really tied to that day-to-day approach of reaching and engaging diverse donor groups and ensuring that DEI goals can be tied to measured impact. So that is an enormous amount of data in a very short period of time. We have even more trends in our full report, which will be released tomorrow, February 12th. And so in all of this, combining these trends with CCS's overall experience, we want to share with you 5 key summary trends. We'll just touch on these very briefly. These trends really center around retention, stewardship, being able to diversify fundraising sources, and being ready and nimble to accept a variety of types of gifts. Now, when you think about these takeaways and the data, how can we best translate this into a tactical approach? So, our next slide really offers 5 specific areas of best practices that you can revisit and sharpen within your approach, bring to your teams, and think about for the coming year. So, this next slide really outlines what those specific areas of focus can be. And that looks at specifically the opportunity to look at your staff roles and functions, utilize your board for greater clarity in their role in fundraising, understanding how you're using new and emerging technology, and ensuring that your stewardship practices can remain relevant and focused on retention. Now, with those tips, let's hear from our esteemed panelists. Building on this idea of unpacking and applying these trends, we are really grateful to have 3 incredible professionals. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Shaw, Vice President for University Advancement at Prairie View A&M University, where he leads advancement, directing fundraising and alumni engagement. Jeff has 2 decades of experience combined not only at Prairie View A&M, but with Harris Stowe State University, Texas Southern, UNCF, and Florida A&M. He has a proven track record of expanding endowments, securing major gifts, and strengthening engagement strategies. Jeff is joined by Kira Albert, a foundation leader at the Elkins Foundation. Kira leads philanthropic initiatives at the Elkins Foundation, which strengthens communities and creates lasting impact focused in Houston and the greater Gulf Coast. Kira has more than 20 years of experience advancing fundraising and strategic growth for nonprofits. She's had leadership roles at Houston Parks Board, MyAgro, Touch Health, and has driven from a fundraising side transformative programs across education, healthcare, and community development worldwide. Thank you, Kira, for being here. And Kira and Jeff are both joined by Melissa Arias, Chief Chapter Advancement Officer at Make-A-Wish America. Melissa is a senior nonprofit leader, bringing more than 2 decades of experience in fundraising, executive leadership, and organizational growth. She's led fundraising and organizational initiatives across chapter and university settings and has partnered closely with her executive teams to really ensure a maximized impact of philanthropic endeavors and meaningful outcomes for children nationwide. Thank you so much, Jeff, Kira, and Melissa, for being here today. And for our audience, please drop your questions into the chat. We may not have time to address your specific questions live, but we will have the ability to follow up after the webinar. So let's set the context. Among all of these data trends, you each have shared some aspects of your work that are really top of mind for you, places where you've moved the needle in the last year. And I'd love for each of you to share and highlight those. And so, Jeff, starting with you, we talked about the important role that AI is playing and the importance of moving from curiosity to test cases. And you are doing that. So we'd love to hear more about what you and the university are doing with AI.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for allowing me to speak on that. So yes, so right now, the University at Prairie View, in my advancement office, I've been here a little over a year, and one of the things that I wanted to put in place was utilization of AI. So we've actually brought on 2 AI agents that we consider an extension of our organizational chart. So we have 2 employees, AI employees. One is a grant writer named Grant, and the other one is a social media person called Maggie. And they're AI agents that we can interact with. We can send them emails. Grant goes out and researches grants that coincide with our mission and things that we do, and looks for grants that that basically will align with what we do, but also we have a good chance of getting. He kind of ranks them on which ones have a good probability of us getting. And he will begin to start, if we allow for him to, he'll start writing the LOIs. He'll prepare a proposal that will fit into a portal or whatever we need to submit it. And he will submit those things to us for review so that we can go back and forth with him until we get something that we want to actually present and submit as a proposal. Maggie, our social media content person, what she will do is we can go into a calendar and let her know the things that we have going and what's coming up and things that we're working on. Connect her to our social media account, and she'll start drafting social media content relevant to the things that we're looking to do. She will also mimic what our brand styles and things like that are, so that she's producing content that's in line with our content, and we can interact with her as well. But it's new. We're hoping that maybe a year from now we can come back and say, hey, here's all the wonderful things they did, and here's how much we were able to raise based upon it. But right now, we're really enjoying interacting with them as extensions of our employees.
Thanks, Jeff. I imagine there will be a lot of follow-up questions and curiosity on that. And this really highlights two trends that we're seeing in the use of AI. One around how to use AI for generating content or summary content. The second being any kind of virtual engagement officer that's really working as an extension of your team.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, Melissa, you have a front and center row to change management and a lot of the data unification and shared systems that you're building across the network. And as we think about structural changes and optimization for teams, you've lived this over the last year. So we would love to hear more about this.
Yes. Well, for many of you who know or don't know, Make-A-Wish is made up of 57 unique nonprofits that are all coalesced in one federation, which means that we had 57 unique ways of tracking donors, tracking data, tracking our progress. And we knew that we needed to bring everyone into one system, which would really allow us to move the needle on our ability to truly make investments both in philanthropy, but then also to see those successes. And so it was complicated. I won't say it was easy, and I know that lots of you have done this work, but now we are fully immersed where all 57 chapters are actively working in one system for the first time ever. We created the change management in fits and starts, but we've been doing it all along to create those rules of the road and rules of engagement, which have really allowed us to see substantial success, particularly in how we're working with donors and donor stewardship, because now we can see who's in our ecosystem and how many individuals are being touched by one or two donors that might serve multiple territories. So it's really changed the way we think about our work, the quality of the data that we have in order to make decisions and investments, and we're seeing the impacts. I know that there are our major giving team this year has seen success in a way that we've never seen it in our 45-year history. And I know a lot of that is due to this consistent choice to bring us all together into one ecosystem.
Melissa, I think to that point of growth in major gifts and principal gifts, if I'm not mistaken, you saw upward of 30% growth because of this incredible data alignment.
A little bit less than that, but yes, we are seeing tremendous growth at the national level, and kudos to that team that's doing that work. I think a couple of them are on this call, which has been phenomenal. But I think what it's really allowed us to do is to show the enterprise that we're better together than individually. And our ability to create environments that want to invite donors in to make transformational change will happen in a much more successful way if we're working together, as opposed to going in kind of individualized proposals to any one given funder, and that we really think about our world as being more infinite than finite, which is, I think, a problem that all of us in nonprofits get to. It's like, oh, if so and so is going to this donor, then I can't. But as opposed to us now seeing how we can pool our resources, our stories, and our impact together to really put those transformational proposals in front of people.
I think if there's one piece we can all understand and unite around is the importance of quality data. And we can also know that the systems and data we have can often be a work in progress. Now, Kira, you have a unique perspective, of course, in your long tenure in the nonprofit sector and now as a funder. And as you're seeing and reading grant applications and interfacing with different nonprofits, you've been able to really understand how a lot of this comes to life. And I'd love to hear your reflections on what communication with nonprofits or grantees is like, especially around the idea of outcomes.
Yeah, I think, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to hear all of your perspectives. I think a key question that I'm always asking myself is our funding making an impact? And it's such a basic question, but for organizations to really go back to the basics and communicate that, I think so many of us, it's information overload. You get so many emails. The news is constantly changing. There's so many messages being thrown at all of us. And there's a lot of complexity and nuance in a lot of the messages, which is important to maintain. But each of us in our own organizations has our own language and acronyms. And I think just really focusing on plain language, clear communications and outcomes is really important because there are so many great organizations out there. So to really chart how you're different. And I think, Melissa, your process that you've undergone is so donor centered, how you described, donors wanting to maybe be a part of many chapters and support the mission. So that's a great example as well.
One of the things that came up when we were all talking ahead of today's conversation, what came forward among all of three of you is this really the central importance of stewardship and how stewardship uplifts and strengthens donor retention. And what we know, of course, from the data is that donor retention is a major area of opportunity for overall philanthropic growth. And so would love to hear, tossing this to all of you, about what specific stewardship touch points you've tried or that you want to try that are helping to connect with donors.
Well, I'll be happy to jump in because stewardship was a big part of what we kicked off when I started here at the university. And listening to our donors, our corporate donors, our individual donors, we were missing a step in letting people know how did we use your gift? How was your gift utilized? So we became very intentional about doing things. One of the things that we started was making sure that we do a donor impact report. Now I know that sounds very basic because a lot of people provide these impact reports. But what we found is that some places were some funders were very specific in how they wanted to receive their impact reports. And some places didn't even require an impact report. But what we realized is that everybody wants an impact report, whether they ask for it or not. So what we did is we formalized that process to where everyone gets an impact report. We have a report that we create that is very standardized. It looks really nice, has a great presentation, talks about how your money was used, if there were scholarships, what kind of students received the scholarships, in what areas was the money used, what percentages, very nice graphs, letters from the deans on the impact of their gift, letters from the president on what they've done. And once we package that up really, really nicely, we start sending it out to all of our corporate donors to let them know, here's exactly how your money was used. And they were able to go back, take that back to their staff and their teams and say, hey, the money that we gave to Prairie View was very well utilized, and here is how they utilized it. And what we saw was a huge increase in calls and recognition saying, this is amazing. This is exactly what we need. This is what we like. And we started to see that some people were starting to renew their commitments with us almost immediately. And in some cases, increasing their commitment with us and retaining them as donors. So that's just one of the areas that we focused on that we saw almost an immediate impact in.
Within the preparation of those impact reports, to any notes or points of advice for utilizing staff time in preparing those reports?
Yeah, because it did take a lot of staff time and plus it was something new for us. So it actually took more time than I thought it was going to take, pulling all of that stuff together, because we also got student testimonials and had to figure out who's going to reach out to the students to get those things, who's going to combine some of the information and things like that. So what we're looking at in our second iteration, or as we move forward with this, is we're actually looking at some different tools, AI and other software that's out there that can help simplify the donor impact report process. So we're in the process of looking at that. However, we have been using some of the AI tools like Copilot and things like that to assimilate some of the data we're getting from the departments to create a nice graphical interface of how the dollars are being used to simplify some of that process. So AI is currently helping us now, but we're looking for additional tools as well.
One point that I've used on specific reports is, you can, some gifts might be highly restricted, and so it needs to be a specific report for that donor, but many sections or pieces can be repurposed, which I think is great, whether it's campaign specific or whatever, and then used to be sent to all donors to look personalized, but it isn't necessarily drafted specifically for them.
Mhm.
I think that what I would say to tag on to the great work that Jeff is doing is the most important piece of this is sharing the impact of your work with donors at every level. And I think that sometimes we as nonprofits get very caught up in what it's going to look like and how detailed is it going to be and how expensive is it going to be for us to produce this big impact report, this glossy annual report. And at the end of the day, I love to hear what you said about plain language in receiving grants and updates on grants. It's like, really, donors just want to hear from us. And if it is black and white on a piece of letterhead that shares the impact and what your gift did, or whether it's something that you could use a great tool in your AI arsenal or in any of these spaces to build, they just want to hear from you. And I think it's consistency. It's like we talk so much about stewardship, but I think our ability to execute on stewardship has always been difficult in all of the nonprofits that I've been engaged with over the years. And so if we can kind of boil it down to like just a clear message, consistent data points, and a consistent cadence in which we share those impact stories, that's really what resonates, I've seen in my history with donors.
Yeah. And one other thing really quickly, like if there are ways that you can automate some of your stewardship in a way that still comes across as personal, because we don't want it to look too automated. But one of the things that we've done is like our CRM, it'll send out a birthday card on the day of your birthday, because it kind of combs through the database, finds whose birthday is today, and we have an electronic card that it sends to them with a personalized message that says, hey, we recognize today is your birthday. We just wanted to say happy birthday to you. So it's a very personal message to someone who's an alum or a donor. And they get that on the day of their birthday. But it's also something that we don't have to think about on a day-to-day basis, because sometimes, you think about birthdays are kind of hard to manage. And sometimes people do it like once a month, they'll get everybody together and do it. But this is something our system can do on a daily basis where we don't have to touch it, but we've created a touch point to where some of our alums have posted it on their social media, like, hey, look what my school sent me today. And they get excited about it. And it's something that we were able to automate, but it feels really good to the person.
Yeah, I really would double down on that ability to automate semi-personalized, large-scale options, similar to what Jeff just said about birthday cards. I know that in your report you talk a lot about the growth in mid-level and the retention around mid-level donors. And at Make-A-Wish, we've put a lot of effort into creating kind of a mid-level donor experience that's very automated. But for those donors, for us, that $500 to $5,000 space, it feels very personal, and they're getting a lot more touches than they ever have before. And they're folks that are probably not in a portfolio, so they're not getting those personal phone calls, but they still are, really appreciating that level of kind of continuous communication with them.
Yeah.
And your note on mid-level giving, Melissa, also touches on the next thematic question for you all around how you're navigating the dynamic environment with different external pressures, whether that's policy, funding sources, donor behaviors. How are you focusing and prioritizing on certain aspects of your funding model to assess risk and lean into resilience?
I think one of the things that, and I don't know if this directly answers your question, Lindsay, but first you have to have a diverse portfolio of ways that you're raising revenue. And if you're not diversified, and any time in any issue, whether it's a financial crisis or political change, one of your pillars is going to weaken. And so the ability to lean into those others. So the first thing I would say is ensure that you're diversified, and then utilize the information that you have about your portfolio to say, we know from our history, our data, and what's going on in the environment that this is a time when we really need to double down on mid-level giving, or we really need to ensure that we retain donors because it's so much more expensive to go out and find new donors in this environment. And so I think the first step is ensuring that you have a diverse group of revenue streams so that you can identify which one to lean into.
Jeff, you mentioned previously some of the different uh, dynamic shifts within the HBCU community and how you and the university are thinking about DEI and fundraising and revenue all related into those shifts.
Yes. So what we noticed is that, in this new climate of how we are looking at DEI and determining DEI, with a lot of corporations, they've either shifted their initiatives because of some of the DEI changes in this new administration that we're in, and then also with some of the government funding and things like that has changed. A lot of us in higher education may have received that dear colleague letter that says, please remove these DEI terms from your scholarships and what have you. So we've had to make that pivot in those areas. But what we've also seen is that, a lot of times people say that philanthropy kind of finds a way and kind of finds a way to balance itself. So where in some areas we've lost money, we've seen some of our corporate funding has fallen off to a certain degree because some areas they've lost funding, or they're reorganizing and trying to figure out how they're going to do it. So we've seen some dips in that. But then when we look at our individual donors, I mean, it has skyrocketed. I mean, we have really seen a huge increase in individual giving. And then we have things like the Mackenzie Scott phenomenon that has happened, where, in speaking, well, not, of course, I didn't get the chance to speak to Mackenzie Scott, but, speaking with her team and seeing some of the interviews that she's done, she looks at areas where there's deficits that are happening in current times. And if she sees that there's some kind of lack of funding in a certain area, and in this particular time, she was looking at DEI, how can I help and fill the gap on some of those things? So we were lucky enough to be a recipient of the $63 million from Mackenzie Scott,
Wow.
because she saw value in being able to help schools that potentially could be losing funding because of some of these initiatives. And she wanted to come fill the gap. So where we lose in one area, you gain in another. So we've been able to pivot. But the main thing is we're trying to build our individual giving base to the point where when we lose in corporate and government funding, we have a pool of individual givers that can help sustain us. And we haven't always had that, but we're making remarkable strides in building that individual database back up again.
Jeff and Melissa, you both highlighted the importance of individual giving and the focus there as but one of several different known revenue streams that can help. And Jeff, you also mentioned what we know to be true, which is that philanthropy does tend to be resilient. It does experience fluctuations, but on average and big picture, it is more resilient than other economic markers often are. And we'll be really interested to see how that looks as the next set of Giving USA data comes out in June. Kira, from a funder's perspective, with this dynamic environment, what are you looking for with organizations who are looking to ready and pivot in this current funding landscape?
I think sharing the kind of context and positioning of the work is really important. So often organizations get into the detail of what they're doing and kind of stating the problem, the ecosystem of organizations that might address that, and how you're unique in your approach is really important. I think always balancing kind of the heart and the head, like the data with the stories, is really important as well. And one thing, Lindsay, that you touched on that I find really fascinating is the whole board engagement topic. I think certainly for foundations, many foundations ask the percentage of your board that gives. That's often something they want to know. But even outside of the foundation world, um, that board are your most committed, engaged people who have committed their time. And I think, any gift amount, but some gift amount giving on an annual basis more than the actual amount is so important. And working with them to kind of acquire donors and do, like, view them almost as an extension of the development team is so important. And we don't have time to really get into that, but
Yeah.
I'm glad that the research touched on that and touched on organizations whose revenue is expanding really are those who have the board engagement kind of figured out. Was one thing that I noted in your presentation.
That's right. We can gather for another webinar to talk about board engagement, which is a very rich topic, but I'm really glad that you raised that and that is outlined. And we would encourage everyone to think about how to share that information with your boards and look at ways to operationalize those expectations and the communication around it, as well as celebrate your board members who are doing a lot of this naturally. As we wrap up today, we want to hear from each of you one piece of advice, a tip, an action step, something that's really spoken to you from the data or from our conversations that nonprofit leaders can take back to their teams.
Well, I would say definitely lean into the tools that are out there that can help. Many of you work in small shops, and the AI and some of the automation and your CRM sometimes are capable of more than what you're using them for. So you really lean into some of those things because it can really help, particularly some of those small shops that don't have the staff to do a lot of the things that we hear that is needed in stewardship and in prospecting and things like that, and figure out ways to augment what your staff can do with some of these tools so that you can get more done by using the automation. So I would definitely say do that.
I'm going to go back to, oh, sorry. I'm
Go
going to go
ahead.
back
You
to
go.
the board. And I think, whether in combination with your CEO or alone, make time to meet one-on-one with board members and get out of just the give or get. Like, those are two concrete things, but get to know them and share kind of your prospect lists, the people you're trying to reach, to have them partner with you on the mission, because that will be rewarding for them.
I totally agree with what both Jeff and Kira said. I think those are absolutely two of the best steps. And I think if I was to add anything, it's like, don't let your fear of doing the thing stop you from getting out and talking to your donors, right? Don't overanalyze your data to the point that you can't get out, you can't put your portfolios together, you can't get out and meet with donors. Don't analyze whether or not this is the right impact report. Just do something and get it out in a good cadence. I think that's something that we all can get, especially when we're in small shops. It's like, are we doing the right thing? At some point in time, you just have to do the work.
Just do it. Just do it.
Yeah. And we're in a relationship built business, right? So
Yeah.
meeting with donors, meeting with board members yields new ideas and opportunities as well.
Mhm.
Jeff, Kira, Melissa, thank you so much for this discussion. One we could continue for many more hours. We really value your partnership and everything you do in our communities. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. The recording from the webinar will be distributed by email, as well as our full report, which will be available tomorrow, February 12th. And really, on behalf of myself and all of my colleagues at CCS Fundraising, would love to thank you and our panelists for everything you do in our community and for the nonprofit sector. We see you, we value you, and thank you for joining us today. And please keep in touch. Have a great day ahead.